And we'll let Larry take it away. All right.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Moore. I'm publisher of Broadstone Books, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the September 2021 edition of our Broadstone Reading Stage Zoom series. I'm somewhat amazed to note that this is our 12th event since launching the series last October with a reading that was hosted by our very good friend and Broadstone author, Susanna Case. And during the time since then, we've featured the work of over 24 writers. Now, while I wish that we had the pandemic in our rearview mirror by this point, I am pleased that a series that we inaugurated out of necessity has become a regular and very enjoyable feature of our calendar, and it's one that we look forward to continuing in the months ahead. Today, I'm pleased to welcome two new readers to our Zoom stage. David Salner, who is joining us from his home in Delaware. And for a pleasant change, I have a reader who's joining me in person. I'm going to swivel here just for a moment. Tom Zemsky is here in person in the Broadstone headquarters, and he'll be reading here in a bit. Now, both had books appear just before or during the pandemic, and I'm happy to have this slightly belated opportunity to bring them to your attention. Now, at first glance, these two authors might seem to have very little in common, at least stylistically and thematically, but both are graduates of the distinguished Iowa Writers Workshop, and both are writers who've spent their working careers outside of the academic world. I'm looking forward to discussing with David and Tom how these factors have shaped their approach to their writing. Since earning his Iowa MFA, David Salner has lived and worked all over the US as an iron ore miner, steel worker, machinist, bus driver, cab driver, garment laborer, longshoreman, and my personal favorite, telephone solicitor for 24 hours. Until today, he works as a librarian. So he did have an honest job or two before that, at least. He lives in Delaware with his wife, Barbara Greenway, who's a high school English teacher. David's poetry has been published widely, has won numerous awards and citations, and includes his Broadstone books collection, The Stillness of Certain Valleys, which was up on the screen a moment ago. Most recently, he's the author of A Place to Hide, a novel set in the 1920s about a fugitive from Montana vigilantes who works on the Great Holland Tunnel Project and finds shelter among the poor Jews of the Lower East Side of New York. That description is also a nice overview of the historical themes and working class experiences that he treats in his poetry, in which regard I find him a worthy successor to one of my favorite poets of everyday life, David Ignato. Tom Zemsky was born in Hamilton, Ohio in 1947, and is noted, received his MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop as well. Since 1976, he's made his home in Lexington, Kentucky, where he worked for many years as a warehouseman for the International Book Project. Now retired, his favorite pastimes include listening to jazz on LP, of course, Latin American and modern literature, and movies according to the auteur theory. He believes that poetry, first and foremost, is metaphor, and that is something that will become very obvious when you hear him read shortly. He's the author of 2 volumes of poetry from Broadstone, After the Storm, and more recently, A New School of Design. A 3rd collection, Elephant, will be appearing early in 2022. Fellow poet Robert Eastwood, who is with us here today from his home in California, has said of A New School of Design that it bewitches with its unexpected leaps of association, its many sudden surprising images. In a book with poems that often dispense with organic unity, I have to let the cat walk in front of me now. And poems that often dispense with organic unity. There is play and process of a mind obsessed by metaphor, a mind interacting with a world often lacking in coherence, but one that builds a new, richer reality. Tom will be sharing his special reality with us a little bit later this afternoon. But first, I'm pleased to welcome David Salner to the reading stage.
There. Now you can hear me, right? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, great. Well, I was just saying before I realized that what I was saying was being muted, was to thank Larry and to thank Broadstone and all of you for this opportunity. I'm especially glad to be reading with Thomas, whose book I really enjoyed. And I think this sort of takes off on some of the things Larry was saying, that because Broadstone is an independent publisher, and one of the most important aspects of being independent, which is one of those big vague words, but is independent of academia. And I really, because academia is a place that I know I could never survive in. I really respect the people who are strong enough to withstand what's going on in academia now. Rather than go into a long thing about that right now, I want to begin with where all poetry reading should begin. Beer for breakfast. The chrome-colored clouds pushed the heat down, held in the car fumes, the smell of hot asphalt. Out on the patio, I was ready for work in crepe-soled boots and t-shirt and jeans, had my lunch made up. The first buses went by. All over town, they swayed on macadam. Bald tires crunched glass. Streets sparkled with dust, with granules and shards. I cracked open my first just then, as a new rouge sun showed through a bandage of clouds, a fretwork of power lines above the tar roofs. I opened another, impressed with myself. I was giving the finger to dead-end jobs, getting pretty well primed. All over town, I heard people stir, felt them reach for a smoke, hurt lungs sucking in the sweet myrrh, holding it, eyes shutting tight on the pain we felt back then when we were young. I lit one too, exhaled a garland of smoke, and finished the six-pack. Just to confess something, which is that I very seldom had a beer for breakfast. And although I guess having a beer for breakfast before going to work works out a lot better now with virtual work. Most of the poems I'll read are from Stillness of Certain Valleys, the Broadstone book, that was really, I think, really well produced. It's really a wonderful job that Broadstone did. The next poem I want to read is about an incident that occurred in when I worked on as an iron ore miner in northern Minnesota, about the great, when the tremendous layoffs in steel happened and thousands of miners were laid off work. We received wonderful support from farmers in the area. And this is about one such incident. Horse trailer with beans. One night, I woke to the clang of a man unhooking a horse trailer in the darkness in front of my house, loosening the coupler, dropping it on the road, leaving me with 3 tons of beans. He couldn't wait for the thanks I would have given on behalf of the laid-off miners at the food pantry. He had to drive all night to get home to fields full of corn and more beans, work, a herd of beef cattle, and a life that would leave him with nothing but the dirt under his nails and who he is. So one of these farmers, Darrell Ringer, was a leader of American agriculture movement, and he invited me to come to a farm foreclosure protest, which, and I thought, well, I have to, not only because it would be an interesting thing, but also to do a little bit to repay the debt that we had to those farmers. So this next, and that incident is something that I hadn't thought about very much till just the last few weeks when I wrote this poem, which is my very newest poem, A Meditation on the Land, Remembering a Farm Foreclosure, for Darrell Ringer, 1953 to 93. Thank you, he said, while the black eyes drilled from the shadow of his ball cap as we stood in the sun-baked square of a Kansas town where we just rallied against such business as no one with honor should dare to defend. Then drove over Pock Macadam, between shoulders cascading with purple wildflowers, wheat turning green to gold, the field after field, the rich carpet called forth, turned over, culled with such care that I, for one, don't have blisters enough to imagine. And beneath it, the black earth seethes with world-feeding life. Then we arrived at his farm. Beautiful, I'd often thought, this life, how the green soybean hug at the earth, and alfalfa explodes into pink, and animals trudge toward us in the slow motion rhythm of paddock-bound shadows until their heads hike up with quick interest when hay bales are pitched with a thud between the tarnished steel rails of the crib. But the earth and its moods are uncertain, despite the disconsolate pleading it gets when sleep doesn't come, that a storm please pass by without flooding at harvest, that a drought not set in, the wind not whisk topsoil to a powder dry ash floating off in a glitter-filled cloud to the red of a summer-long sun. And of course, words are addressed to the notice of debt that's attached like a leech to the title, which is after all a mere sheet of paper, approved by the courts, but without the least smell of wet dirt to grace it. And of all he foresaw or was faced with, what he couldn't agree to was losing this land without even a fight. They might take it all, but the fight, at least, they couldn't take that. Are you hearing a lot of background noise from me? No? Tell me.
The only occasionally
cute
a
little
dog
dog.
barking.
What's that?
A cute little dog occasionally will bark. That's all. And we'll take that
Okay,
out
it was
in
only the dog?
post-production. Yeah.
Okay.
And we can take that
Thanks.
out in post-production.
Sorry.
So don't worry about it.
The dog, I don't have control over the dog, unfortunately. I've tried to train it, but I guess I haven't done a very good job. So the next poem I wanted to read was, if you see a movie called North Country that stars Charlize Theron, it tells the story of a mine that of the main mine that I worked at in northern Minnesota, where a gang of thugs, despite the efforts of many of us, treated the women miners horribly. So this is for the women of Eveleth Mines. You walked into a mill, balancing on steel rods, which rolled like logs and stumbled just like a man would stumble. You laid track and pinched your hand between the rails. Your hand turned purple-black, bruised just like a man's. You cut your arm on the knife edge of a pillar block, which made you bleed just like a man. The rich pink tissue, the gash into your life, you had to wash it out and bandage it and keep on working just like a man. You torched a wear plate in a chute. A shower of white hot sparks burned through your coveralls, but you kept working, shimmied up chutes, stacked plates on grate all midnight shift, got held 2 hours overtime, cursed the boredom, bit your lip, just like a man. Stacked more plates till you could taste the salt of your blood mixed with the metal grit. You worked just like a man till they did something they wouldn't do to any man. You know, on days that are beautiful, I understand it's really beautiful in Frankfurt too, just as it is here. Is there a certain sadness in that beauty because you think of it and you think that, well, life doesn't really measure up to that. So anyway, that's the feeling that I had in this poem, Spring, the Perfection of Art. Spring, the Perfection of Art. I'm sitting on a rough bench outside a cabin under a glassy sky on a spring day that is perfect for the sadness of art. While a woman I can't see sings her heart out in the sun. Her song has no words I can understand. I can't tell what place in the heart her sadness comes from. Perhaps a letter she has just arrived telling her of the death in a distant land of an old love. And she could not be at the funeral. I don't know which land, which of dozens, where so many loves have been buried in the spring earth. The letter is on her desk, but it was folded in the envelope for too long to now lie flat and stirs in the breeze on a day that is perfect for this sadness. And she is not at the funeral. This poem is about someone who suffers from addiction. I'm sure we've all known people like that, wonderful people, except for the fact that they're addicts and they're not able to overcome it. This person was also a lifeguard. Deep sea rescue. For years, the sea washed away childhood beatings, worse abuse, pummeling him in a timeless dream of risk. He discovered alcohol then drugs because surrendering was how he'd learned to swim from rips. He lifeguarded summers. In the winter, he built homes. The hills above the sea were full of hammering. Hawk high, he'd take a break and wipe the sweat away, watching the miles of silence, sunlight weeping on endless crests, each one a tiny breath. Closing his eyes, he'd feel beneath this peacefulness a mood in the waves, the worry of a storm far out. He taught deep sea rescue, became an active member of AA, but still we had to rush him more than once to an ER. Not easy. for him or us, the saving of a savior. Entering treatment, he repeated formulas that sometimes helped. That he was not to blame for whirlpools opening like the mouth of someone crying, drowning. The last time I saw him, he was turning toward the sea, searching for something lost, someone to bring back safe. I have another confession, which is that this is not actually, I suppose I've known some people like this, but this is not actually based on any of those people. It's based on an obituary that I read and that moved me very deeply. Just two more. Despite the fact that I enjoyed and still enjoy a shift of work, isn't it true that no matter how much you like your job, you're always glad when the shift is over? So this is A Dream of Quitting Time. And it's also from The Stillness of Certain Valleys. From break to break, I'll wish my shift away, shower off sand, go out into the crystal clear, all clear of quitting time. Midnight in Arizona, soaring like a nighthawk over Guadalupe, this town I work in, where Yaqui Indians have been driven into a corner of a long-lost nation. Still further to Apache Junction, home of Nate's used cars and girls, girls, girls. To Globe, Morenci, where copper towns are dying, leaving high-rise dumps of orange tailings, listless hills of slag. Or along the dried out Gila River into a basin of forgotten lives, where Brandy Riley says goodbye to Jason Sanchez, a loud kiss, a silent night in Casa Grande. Or float above a lonesome bird's eye of saguaros, careen on desert monsoons, almost to the border. To Bisbee, home of the famous deportation, surrounded by the tufts and brambles on the otherwise bare-assed Mule Mountains. I'll float into the desert night beneath a firmament of sand. So I'm going to read one more, a much older poem about my adoptive mother. It's about the conversation that adopted kids have with their parents, where their parents explain how they're the special ones, they were chosen. So, choice. It's a wonderful thing to have a mother you didn't come from. I can remember when I was 4, the heavy varnish on the floor I was playing on in one of those apartments built all over Baltimore after the war. My mother holds me in the glitter of her black eyes, which express humor easily, strength and care, and love with difficulty. She has my father there for backup. It's a conversation filled with produce words. We picked you out, as if I were an avocado and they were squeezing my chubby knees, or a cantaloupe. My mother sniffs my belly button while the world looks on. We'll take this one, she announces, because he's ripe. Both of them are smoking, and the words parade in the smoke, dance in the air, high overhead, meaningless as motes. For I had already adopted my mother when she was a girl about my age, playing on the marble steps in a neighborhood where poor Jews lived in row houses. My Orthodox grandmother had a painting of a handsome man, her husband, who disappeared when his bank failed. They never saw him again. As I stared at the painting, I understood my father would disappear also, in a way my mother never would. The words meant nothing to me, for my mother's eyes had already told me what I had to know. I was not the fruit of her body, but of something more important, her choice. I was the fruit of a woman's choice. So that's the last poem I'll read. But I did want to say in relation to that poem that next October 2nd, marches will be taking place all over the country, including, I know there's one in Louisville, to defend a woman's right to choose abortion, which is fundamental to her right to control her body. I just thought I'd throw that in since the poem I just read gave it a perfect segue. And I also wanted to really thank Larry for plugging my novel. And after you've bought my book, well, if you haven't already bought it, and Thomas's book, maybe you'll go to Amazon or order it from me, A Place to Hide. And really, I don't have anything to add about it besides what Larry so kindly read off. So that's my portion, and I'm really eager to hear the rest.
All right. Well,
I'll mute.
all right. Well, bravo. It was wonderful to hear you, David. Again, the joy for me in being able to have these events is to be able to hear this poetry in the voice of the poets. And I'm grateful for the poems that you chose, particularly the ones that were expressing that working class experience, because when I first read your manuscript, I flashed back to a line that had stayed with me, and I alluded to this in my introduction, a line that had stayed with me from all the way back probably in high school with poetry about get the gasworks into a poem. Yeah, Ignato. And I thought you got the steel mills and the mines, and I think that's something we should all be grateful for, and something that is perhaps missing from a great deal of poetry now. I think if you go back to the period of the Beats, so many of them were working class writers that brought that working class experience to their words. So I think that's something that is a particular gift of your work. But you can unmute again, because I want you to talk though for a moment about how you found your way to Iowa, and what you so talk briefly about your experience with the Iowa Writers Workshop and what that has meant for your work.
Well, that was a few years ago.
Right.
It was really more than half a century ago. So, but what it's meant is, I think that there's a whole literary tradition. And that's one of the things that workshops today are trashing. You know, the fact that there's a literary tradition, there's wonderful poetry published in the 16th century, the 17th century, as well as great poetry being published today. So I was, all of the schooling that I had, which was, people are surprised to find out that I didn't have schooling, but really it gave me an invaluable sense of language. And I think my father, that I have a lot of, even looking back on it now, mixed feelings towards, but his respect for language is something that I always aped, you know, and tried to learn. I tried to learn something from them then, and have always respected ever since. So anyway, that's what I got from that. I think I had some good teachers. I think now it would be, well, I won't go into what I think the workshops are like now. But I'm just glad I was, like Thomas, outside of academia, able to learn about other things.
Right, absolutely. I know you write a lot about your experiences when you were, whether it was working in the mines, working in the mills. Were you writing very actively during those times? Have you always written, or are you kind of taking that experience now and distilling that into work that you're creating today? Sort of what's your practice been over the years?
No, I wrote almost not at all for many, many years. And I just returned to writing, I guess it was late 50s, my late 50s or thereabouts. I wasn't able to really do manual labor very well anymore. And the fact that I could write was really a great, it was a great satisfaction to me. So I still felt that I was able to do that. And I don't know, I'll just say another thing to return to what you were asking about before, which is that actually, especially American writers have had a great deal of experience out in the world in working class jobs, and they brought it into their writing. And it's something I've read the criticism of Melville, Twain, other writers, at Whitman. It never talks about the fact that they were people out in the world. Whitman was not only a journalist, but a carpenter, and of course, a nurse in the Civil War. And then Melville, we know. What would Moby Dick be? What would the classic piece of American literature be if he'd never gone to sea and become a sailor? So this is part of our experience. It's just that we've adopted, when I say we, I mean, those who kind of let us know what literature should be, have adopted a much more narrow scope, more and more so in recent years. Anyway, I shouldn't go on any more than that.
Well, actually, I appreciate that soapbox, because that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you read today, and also a reason for our next reader that I'm going to rotate the screen here in a moment. But as I move the screen to introduce you all again to Tom Zemsky, who'll be reading next. Although it says Larry Moore on the screen, I assure you this is Tom Zemsky. And I just want to acknowledge one other person who's in the room that I didn't mention before we started, and that's our very good friend Libby Falk Jones, who's joining us. And I want Tom to know that, because Libby is also one of the people who read and blurbed his book, New School of Design, that he's going to be reading from. So Libby, lovely to have you with us. And now let's have Tom read.
David, your poems got stronger and stronger, by the way. And those last two I enjoyed a great deal. And the one that you said is your most recent poem grew more. The lines are longer. You're growing as a poet. I liked all three of those, the best of the bunch. And not that I didn't like the others as well. I agree totally with your view of the world, as Larry does as well. So we're kindred minds here, I think. I hope. I know what the heck I know. I'm going to read one poem from this first book, and I'm going to read three from A New School of Design, and then I also am going to read some things that aren't in books yet. So this first poem is another look at the Frankenstein story. So it's called Frankenstein 2. Dear Father, I drink my soup without spilling very much, and I'm good, though I have not yet found a place between the birds and fishes. Sometimes I tire of clearing the roads of fallen timber and cutting and stacking it near one or another farmhouse. But how else to repay the tools and meager stores of food and clothing that I would otherwise be stealing? Even when I stay hidden, as you have advised, I know that I am not alone. I have seen myself more often than anyone supposes, shrinking from the moonlight, though I have also known tiny fluttering things come as to a petal in sunlight, your hand, Father. I know I am not the only one to hear cries in the night that make my heart feel my heart. This is not my first April, and I hope at least one villager, like the flowers, holds on to his torch until he has burned his fingers. So, and now I'm going to read 3 from A New School of Design, which is the book that's out now. And all 3 blurb writers, including Libby Falk Jones, gave wonderfully accurate readings of what I was trying to do. So thank you to Libby as well. I'm going to read a longer poem that is this metaphor making. And the one thing I'll say about it is, I wish I could write like this all the time. It's almost like torture. It takes a great deal of sleeplessness to disorient the senses, to get at this kind of combining. I call it like a hyper combining of metaphors. I like it though. I think there's something very magical about it and something beyond logic about it that appeals to me a great deal. And maybe one of the breakthrough poems for this was Or Shakespeare. So I'm going to read this one. Shakespeare the writer or Shakespeare the race car driver? Shakespeare the sous chef or Shakespeare the snake handler? Shakespeare the cathedral or Shakespeare on a bed of nails? Shakespeare the squab on his father's table? Shakespeare the gingham spider, the half yarrow, half chestnut return from Alcibiades? Or Shakespeare in the privy with unwashed song? Shakespeare the lightning architect of houses vanished from railroad flats and knockabout heavens? Or Shakespeare the courtly flowers a lost queen knows where to find? Shakespeare the boatman whose service begins in the presence of blood? The 5 and dime paint fleck symphonies? Or bald dogs dreaming of being caught by albino tigers? Shakespeare the poisoned parasol or Shakespeare the soak? The flypaper army and the bowling trophy clouds, or perfect old wheat sorrow? Shakespeare the million miles of snow Tolstoy barely tasted, or Shakespeare the rush of falling into James Joyce's heart? Shakespeare a wedding gown of stabs, dragged grief polishing jeweled floors? Or Shakespeare shot from a cannon for his 14-year-old gypsy bride? Shakespeare painter, the way light casts a footfall behind every figure? Or Shakespeare screed in cracked wooden bowls? Shakespeare his tackle box of moon baits in a pyramid of Atlantesian laughter? Or Shakespeare the island of burnt toast? Shakespeare able to pull Shakespeare out of a hat? Shakespeare the scullery key to bounty, retired from spoil? Or Shakespeare the anvil's joy at jousting blacksmiths struck in a Beatles dream? The brocade accordion toss into lamplight, or swan smoke swift gaze of incidentalness? Shakespeare the water or Shakespeare the salt? Shakespeare hole in the sock or Shakespeare captain of the fire department at the bottom of the sea? Shakespeare, the gold-toothed rats dipping their tails in choruses of operatic minors. Shakespeare on the moon, or laugh Shakespeare like puppies in a room full of topsy lines. Shakespeare, the museum of scoffs in a lavender tablature, or Shakespeare, the molten shoes impresario. Shakespeare pulling eyefuls of electric algebra over the rooftops of drowned capitals, or rotund confectioner aloud in his stove. Shakespeare, the teacup filled from a keg. Shakespeare or Shakespeare, before Shakespeare or after. I will cry lest I forget the sun not choosing. And then two shorter poems from this book. This is called A Story, and it has a lot to do with experience. David, I too, the thing I find difficult is, and I don't want, learning how to lie. As a writer and as an artist, the things you write don't have to be something that you've experienced exactly that way, or hardly much at all in a way. Experience just comes to you as it does in the way it does. And many people are so much better at accepting that. But anyway, this is kind of a factual thing. It's called A Story. When I was little, I asked an older boy to play my mother. That was a difficult part, calling for inspired improvisation. I'm still amazed at myself as a director before the age of 6. Request denied, of course. I was returned to the company of loneliness, whose minutes include when the apple, unbidden, falls into tall grass, concealed from every appetite but one, whose pleasure is without beginning or end. Described, I guess, by the line vanishing between Mona Lisa's lips. Noon snow that rises from the body of illumination. It's what is familiar in dreams that is full strange. As any child will tell you, I too am unbidden and aspire to digress. And the last one I'll read from this book is just called Poem. And you'll see the subject right away. I see Emily Dickinson as a devotee of heroin. Her kit kept neatly on a dolly, one drop of blood staining a tat, using up half her strength in tying off, and the rest in loosening again the darkened courses of her heart. I see her in the garden, in a wicker chair, fallen snow across her lap, the butterfly wings of her lashes too heavy for the petals of their lids to lift, her inkwell getting watery near at hand. She is sweetly warm, but it's a secret. Will there be time for the gentleman caller letting himself out, shivering at the gate? Is it enough to be stuck with rhyme from her private summer? So that's poems from the books that are published. I have a book that Larry is good enough to bring out also this first quarter of 2022. It's going to be called Elephant. And I'll read two poems from there. One's a bit longish and the other a shorter poem. So the longer one's called A Book. Voice that announces it isn't speaking. Breath's corpse and mute stranger to pull the eye from the side of the widowed ear. Each book is yet several clocks, containing the time it takes to read, the time it took to write, together with uncomprehending time that whitens the hair of fast reader and slow reader alike. There is no limit to the number of ideas that can be found in a book. The books are not skies and ideas are not stars. Oh, let's everyone write a book. Books to make librarians weep for their shelves. Books that must be stolen to be read. Books that give us the courage to ask the madman to stop shouting to himself while he rifles the cans. They say Tolstoy on the day of his birth cried for pen and paper. He had such a long book to write. And I have seen faces, such faces that can resist books, both good and bad. What if there's no book for them? But there must be. Books by anarchists, addicts, orphans, machines. Books that are acts of revenge. Books that deny other books. Books by humanitarians about their pets. Books about personages whose bones departed the clay under their author's feet. Long 300-page books about carpet. Books in languages no one ever speaks. Where are the authors of so many books? Sometimes the library looks like a tiny, endless cemetery, got up off the floor in a land where death has been issued the only card. How the tree eyes the series writer as he hurries by to pick up fresh supplies, or stands gazing in the window at the captive members of its race, longing to drop a branch through the glass so they may know the wind and rain once more. Books replacing one leg of the sofa, propping a window to let the paint fumes out. Books that are three-dimensional wallpaper to the interior decorator. Bed and board to whole families of mites. The driest sleeping tablet. Anonymous safe of misers' dollars and cold caress in which mementos fade. Baby's high chair and mosquito trap, or as counterweight in boxes in the back of cars and trucks to keep their tires from slipping in the snow. Let us toast the many authors and set our glasses on their books. But where are the authors? What were their voices like? And was the silence begun when they stopped speaking, like the silence at the end of one of their books? Love, are we not the sons and daughters our parents wrote in you that we might sing about a book? And the strange joy to be derived from the fact that with the cover closed, its sole purpose is to make fun of the published. And a shorter poem that I'll say this for anybody out there writing. There's a terrible thing, a terrible struggle to keep writing while you're not published in this ocean of so many books being published, and you're not. But the one thing that's surprisingly a blessing out of that is you can go back to poems with a span of years and experience, writing experience, life experience, and open up poems. It's like really finding wonderful things left for you to improve. So you wrote as well as you could at the time, and then nicer thing, you can just do better with work, and it hasn't been exposed yet. So it looks like it's the first way. So this poem was one way before, and I went back to it, and I think I got a better ending to it. It's called February 29th. Where are the elegant introductions to March this day? Not those trains passing through, the stenciled letters, the iron cars, their different shapes and sizes like buckets of rain. So ordinary, the heart is full just to see them moving. And then they're gone, the street dead on the other side. Unless it's an unusual one. Impossible hill straight down to the tracks, the houses wildly aslant, children in the yards and porches laughing and alive because it's not a business street, not development, not a work of art spilled from dump trucks, but a wrinkle of old earth. And when a train comes roaring through, you can talk, but it's like a silent movie. This is long before the discovery of fire, with sword that dies and mustache as befit the constellations. Since cloudburst finales of the famous still come and go as often as do the trains. And there are enough cinders to know it's just old February appearing to vanish young again. Do I stop? Do I keep going on? What do I do?
You keep
Just
going.
whatever I do. I'm going to read another one of the kind of hyper metaphor poems. People said that like them, and then maybe one more after that, and I'll stop. This is called Maybe God Woke Up. Maybe God woke up after creating sleep one day after giving birth to morning and thought, man, I'm going to change the world today, adding a warning and the idea of perhaps to the overall mystery. So was there a baobab before then? Cochineal, catnip, aurora borealis, Moby Dick and the Jupiter Symphony? Did Paris have the same number of bridges? Rome the same number of hills? Was the coral reef already like Times Square with its pickpockets and drug dealers? Were there panatellas and sambas and pyramids north and south? Did gypsies and Cajuns share a campfire? Was there a piebald night ridden out by Mongol and Arapaho together? Were there paper routes and cake plates and noons borrowed from Atlas's brow? Was there America and shy plants and barometric pressure, outside pie tins collecting rain and leaky flats? Were there flagstones teaching wheels to sing like sun bears in the nettles? Game shows and lemon sage and evening editions? Did spring defy fashion with its haute couture? Did the same snowflakes fall? The same wind sweep the stars clean of conundrums? Did love get more than one moon? Was there Cinderella and syphilis? Beaked toads and lightning in all seasons reaching for Jacob's ankle? Did Beethoven hide and wait with what he heard? Was the ocean spit out of a volcano? Were there sacrosanct mesas to accommodate Da Vinci's mind? Was there a stolen owl and a grimy sofa and hollow, bitter doctrinaire failure? Was the continent full of dead generals? Did handsome Johnny come marching home repeatedly even then? Did Prufrock retire as a lion tamer with 34 great-grandchildren? And did Louis Armstrong string bee stings on a golden thread? Was there in fact enough jazz to build a floor in the middle of the stairs so Miss Lonely Hearts might come to rest at last? It's not likely that God was distracted. Was there theater? Of course, there's always theater. It's touching to think so. And none to notice everyone's on stage playing to an empty house with neither a place nor a role in the absence of the beloved fool. As if it were just tomorrow. Tamarind clouds and poets to follow them. Palomino sighs bearing dragons. And yourself to remember. Can people stand 2 more poems? Are we good out there? A shrug, I don't know. I'm going to read one more. I'll read one more slightly long poem, and then I'll read a final one when I'm done. This is called Where the Story Begins. The ringmaster's daughter sold tickets to the bald-headed flea dancing inside a shampoo bubble before she was 10, and learned to drive on the clown car, while the trapeze artist swung her heart over the crowds 3 times daily, though it was to the wire walker's trailer he made a beeline between shows. On long, hot Texas-sized afternoons, she'd overhear the elephants, like prisoners of war, talking about the jungles they had known. A shipwrecked shore of popcorn salt and sawdust under the tarp of heaven. The fortune teller saw madness in her palm. After an all-hands call to break down the big top ahead of a violent storm, she turned her ankle. It would be months before she could resume bareback riding lessons. Humiliated, her most delicate underthing smelled faintly of chimpanzee. Dwindling attendance resulted in the letting go of the dog act, like losing her 8 best friends at once. Who of us can't relate to sitting in the bus station, ready to tell the first stranger who asks, I've run away from the circus, experience nethermost, bound for exotic Carbondale, Illinois. It is, ladies and gentlemen, come from a caution and a wonder at the side of the road. I find that writing and pressing in one kind of way often leads a kind of isometric, and you find coming out of nowhere a poem that's totally in an opposite kind of way that you've been writing. So here's these fiercely enjammed metaphor poems. This is one of the calmest poems I think I've ever written. And it's called The Cookie Jar. I'll end with this. They've come for the cookie jar that killed the baker, it is widely rumored, while hunger looks through the canisters of flour, sugar, and salt, the carcass of butter on ice, bowls of new cream and aged preserves, adopted coconut, cinnamon, and date, for the recipe to the passionate man who harbored it with pity for them both. A really fat guy who liked his work before being scattered into this mob by the self-same fear which now lifts the lid on dazzling emptiness and the still smiling old round grandmother's head on the counter, with nothing better to tell them than capacity 24, give or take 1.
All right. Swivel back to get us both into view. Oh my goodness.
Well, good.
Oh my goodness, Tom. I am, as always, when I hear you read, when I read your work, but especially when I hear you read it, I'm just almost breathless trying to keep up with you. I do want to say, in response to one line in your poem about let's everyone write a book. As a small press publisher, I can assure you that everyone is in fact writing books now.
Oh, yeah.
And what a good thing it is when they're books like yours. There's so many things I could ask. I'm actually going to ask a question on behalf. It wasn't posed as a question, but Libby in chat noted that. She was reminded of Neruda's Book of Questions, which is a good way of asking, who are your influences? Who are the poets that you read?
All right.
So,
probably one of the poet that knocked me out the most early, I would say, is Gregory Corso.
Oh, yeah.
He's so against the grain. He's going to be honest the way he's honest. He's going to speak the way he speaks, and he just doesn't sound like anybody else. He just sounds, he just gets to you faster, better. Then there's a poet that not many people know a lot about, that I think was probably our last best poet. I don't know if he's alive or not now. His name's Alan Duggan. He won the Yale series of young poets. I see David nodding. He knows who he is. I am in awe of his intellect and his humanity and his creativity within poems, a poem after poem. And again, they don't sound like anybody else. They're fiercely independent. And for the first 2 books easily, if not the first 3, he's written about 8 before he died, if he died. Those first 2 or 3 books are astounding me. So that's 2 poets that I can think of. I continually read. I always try to have a group of poets and poems that I just go back and reread over and over and over again. They've set the bar high, and I just want to keep that in front of me. So I'll read Eliot. I mentioned Prufrock. I think that the poem still amazes me. I read Pound. I read Frost. Anyway, those are some of the poets.
That's wonderful. And I'll ask you the same question I asked David, since it's one of the reasons that I threw the 2 of you together in the room. Talk about your road to Iowa. And
I have a good story on that.
That would be good. Let's hear it.
There's a poet named David Schloss, and he taught me at Cincinnati, our undergraduate poetry program. And he influenced me enormously. And his style of teaching, his method of teaching was simply to expose you to more types of poetry, to say, this is what a poem can do. It can also do this. It can also do this. This is, none of these define what a poem has to be. And so he exposed us to it was like getting 3 years of poetry in 1 year. Exposed. And he came from Iowa. He was a classmate of James Tate's and John Anderson's. And so when I actually was accepted to Irvine in California in Iowa Writers Workshop, but because David Schloss went to Iowa, I went to Iowa. So that's the answer to that.
Okay, that's great to know. And you, again, like David, have been a poet working outside of the academic world, outside of the literary world, in terms of sort of the insider game of that. How has that shaped your work? Has it shaped your work? I mean, do you think your choices of how you've, you know, made your life and your living have influenced your poetry?
I don't have the work experience that David has.
None of us do.
None of us do. Right, truly. But I'm.
Yeah.
But I do choose and like poets who are work poets. The poets that I named. You named David Ignato, so I get it through the work more than, not that I haven't, I've had a few jobs, but not many. And certainly this last job I had at International Book Project was 30 years at one spot. I don't know if I'm answering the question or not. I don't know. Yeah. Being outside of colleges and such and not getting either exposure or easy praise or any praise is helpful if it doesn't kill you. And so
you've got mail.
There is that. So you can continually work hard at what you're doing, keeping the high bar in front of you, and not slack off. You're not hearing false praise, or you're not hearing. I have the same scorn for what has happened to American literature that David expressed. I'm so in accord with what he said.
Well, and it strikes me that by being an outsider, in that sense, you were perhaps able to be more true to your voice, as opposed to following whatever the current school is or whatever the trend might be at the moment.
Another thing, I was terrified that I would never have a voice. And I'm easily influenced. I'm probably a kind of autistic or schizophrenic kind of person who can easily be swept away under somebody else's influence and just want to sound like them and be like them and never get your own voice. And yet the surprise I have found, and if I were teaching, I would tell this to my students: copy other poets, sound like other poets. What you'll do is you'll do that long enough that you'll slowly move away from it. While that happens, though, choose poets that you like, choose good poets and that you like. You'll learn a world about writing and how to write poems and how to write good poems. And if you just stay with it, it's a miracle. I have no idea the magic of why it happens, but you start to not sound like that person. You start to find your voice while you're writing Gregory Corso poems or anybody, or T.S. Eliot poems, if you dare try. So there's that.
All right. Good to know. Indra, and at this point, I think there's few enough of us that we can kind of throw it open to a little conversation in the time we have left. But Indra, and I think you've posed a question that really goes to both David and Tom, because of the way they've spoken of being kind of outsiders to the academic poetry world. So if I'll just read your question, Indra, and you may want to follow up with them. So what do you say to poets who teach and who invite each other to read from MFA program to MFA program? So this I guess it's fair game now. If you're kind of critiquing from the outside, what would you say to the poets who are in that world? What advice do you have? Would that be the sense, Indran, of what would you, well, how would you like to answer? Whichever one of you wants to
David,
take
you
that
want to go
first.
first? You want to answer that question first?
Well, I'm talking about the institutions. I think you have to be careful about separating institutions from individuals.
Mhm.
And individuals bear the marks of the institutions that they work in, just as Thomas and I bear the marks of the institutions or the companies that we work for, sometimes scars.
Yeah.
But I think that it's just hard to give advice to people working in academia, advice that wouldn't be suicidal for their careers.
That's where I was going to go. The pressure is enormous for people within institutions to return the favor. You pat my back, I pat your back, the thing. So my answer is just keep the bar high. If there's people you know that you really do admire, you can bring them to read or promote them within. But the thing is, there may not be that many. Don't return favors, but again, it's at the risk of your career. So there's a great deal to be said about comfort and how it ruins you, ruins writers, ruins people. So if you stick to your guns, maybe you do get shown the door, and you lose all that comfort and all that easy money. So you got to go there and scrape your knuckles and risk your ankles in the rollers and push enormous weight and do all those horrible things while you're looking for the whistle at the end of the day to blow. But it does support your independence. It does support your I want to say your dignity, your honesty, any of those good things without comfort. So it's a thing you got to weigh. Can you do it? Do you want to do it? Does it mean that much to you?
Yeah, and
I do think, I know I read poets who have never been outside a university setup, and they're great poets. So I try not to say things like I said in a prejudicial way, prejudicial towards the individuals. But I think that, if you look at, I think there has been a detrimental effect, as Thomas and I have been saying. I'd like to ask two things of Thomas. One is David Schloss, see, I knew him. Is he around? Do you know?
I don't know. I've lost some touch with him. He was teaching at Oxford, which is just north of Cincinnati. I had him as teacher at the University of Cincinnati, and then he was teaching at the University of Miami in Oxford, Ohio. He may have gone back to New York. I've lost touch with him. I don't know. If you wanted to get in touch with him, he's his good friend and a fellow classmate of mine at University of Cincinnati is James Cummins. And he's in Cincinnati, and maybe he's online someplace. And you can get
a good idea.
You can get in touch with James Cummins in Cincinnati. He'll know where David is.
Sure.
So,
and the next thing is, would you mind awfully much reading Commerce?
I don't. Is it in one of the books?
It's in. I think that's the name of it. It's in New School.
New School. Okay. Sure.
Oh,
It's
oh,
short,
oh
so.
yeah, twist a poet's arm to read another
Yes,
poem. That's
really.
always that's always so
Exactly,
hard to do.
exactly.
Uh,
I see it. Okay.
Well, while he's looking, I have to just say, Libby, I think you're the one person in the room today that is in fact mostly an academician, because Robert, I know, worked in a variety of professions, but not through academics. So I hope you don't feel like we're beating up on academics today.
There's no rule. I mean, when David taught us and just showed us so many different poets, I'm sure, I didn't, Russell Edson. Whoever heard of writing poems the way Russell Edson writes poems?
I understand, I think what you were thinking more of the sort of the high profile MFA programs, and the work that goes on with those. I mean, my career was teaching all sorts of writing, including creative writing at a liberal arts college. And, it's a gift and a privilege to be able to open students to, both the art and craft of poetry. And it doesn't feel like, it feels a little outsider-ish, to the kind of mainstream high profile MFA world too. I don't feel a part of that, you see. So I think, but then thinking of some folks that I know who are, teaching in those programs, they do very fine work. So I don't know if we can really generalize, but I think there are many routes. I know the poet Morris Manning. I'm sure, some of you know him. He came to read at Berea and spoke to my students, and they were asking him, at the time he was teaching at Indiana's MFA program, and I've had students who studied with him there, but he said to the students, wait till you're 30. Don't go right on from college into an MFA program. You need to live, you need to have experience to write about it. And of course, he wasn't denying the power of of literary traditions at all. He's very well versed in those as well. But, I just think there are many routes, and I'd like to see us celebrate a lot of different routes to finding voice and learning to create from language. So thank you for your responses, though, and the poems, of course.
Okay, so I think he's had time to find his poem.
Right.
It's a very short poem. Commerce. What are numbers compared to imperfection? When I arrive home, I find that I've left a purchase back in the store. How like money to change hands like that? I thought I was going out to buy something for the evening meal instead of participating in magic.
Oh,
I love that.
Two things that David did that are some of the hardest things and that aren't done very much is to write funny poems, humor and poetry. There aren't very many funny poems. And by the way, David, if you get in touch with James Cummins, he has several books out, and he's an extremely funny writer, and one of the very few that is comfortably funny. And the second thing is, of all the seasons, winter and fall are easy to write about, and spring is okay, and summer is really hard. So spring and summer, like you were talking about spring, those are hard ones to write about. I have a few poems on those seasons, but they're not easy. Winter and fall are far easier.
I do want to notice that Indran, in sending his thanks for the answers, referred to them as diplomatic answers. And since, for those of you who don't know, Indran is a professional diplomat. So if he says something is diplomatic, it is very high praise indeed. So, and this has been just lovely conversation. This is one of the things that I do love about being able to have a small group for these sessions where we can have some conversation. We have a few minutes left. Is there anyone else who has anything they want to ask or comment? I will say to my good friend Eileen, I think maybe that advice about waiting until you're 30 for the next step. Eileen is the recent graduate who's now out adulting and is looking for next steps in her life. So so maybe you got some good advice today by tuning in for to a poetry reading. We'll have a last round here. Anyone have anything they want to add or ask?
I do actually have.
Great, thanks, Eileen.
Because I always do. Something that will not shock Larry that really stood out to me in each of your sets of poems were mentions of food. So beer for breakfast, trailers full of beans, Frankenstein's monster eating soup, etc. Because that's something, food is something that I find very compelling to read about and write about as kind of like a connector between, you know, myself and an abstract idea. And so for me, like, food is the thing that I kind of gravitate towards writing about to try and like express in a concrete way something that is very much not concrete. And so I guess my question for each of you is kind of what do you consider to be those kinds of things for yourself that you use to kind of like bridge that gap, like things that are like real and tangible to kind of get a hold of things that are intangible? I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I'll
David,
say
go.
something, since you brought up the question of food. In relation to one poem I read, I wanted to say I guess it's a familiar thing that people are probably familiar things are things people are familiar with, but the only people who need to be concerned about farmers are those who eat food. But food is quite universal. And I noticed the library that I work in now, one of the most requested types of books, and just there's shelf after shelf of it, is cookbooks. But for me, I would say right now, what I'm writing about more than anything else is figures in art and music, and they're looking at what they stood for, and what they've meant to me.
My response to food is I couldn't boil water almost. I can't cook at all, and I like to eat. So I watch food shows on television and enjoy them enormously. So there's that. But as far as my own image making, if I'm always trying to transcend. And so these hyper metaphor poems will take very concrete things and throw them together. And you have no idea how many times I am trying to write those poems, I'll put two things together and they don't work. You just know it. You just put them together and they reverberate in some kind of way, and they work. And you can do it with other words and they don't. So with very concrete kind of things, that works for me. Other than that, I kind of concentrate on images that are not very concrete. And the two images that are central to me, and I use again and again, and if I ever had a collected poems, I would title it for my whole body of work, Noon Snow. Snow I use again and again and again, and I use noon. And the reason why is neither is very exact. You can't know exactly the moment that it's noon or midnight, or maybe any minute anyway. And snow is part of the falling world. It's all the Japanese call it the falling world. It's everything in motion the same way again. I like those two things, stimulate me, and they make me think. They have a poetic beauty for me. So again, if I had a collected poems, I would call it Noon Snow, and there'd be a heck of a lot of poems in there that would either mention one or both of those things.
Well, and now I know that's a title that I can keep in.
That's
keep,
yeah,
for,
fun.
keep for that later book. Well, there was a line that I wrote down from one of Tom's poems when he was reading about, I think the last line about aspire to digress. And I think that's something that we can be grateful to Tom. We can be grateful to David and just to all poets for aspiring to digress, for aspiring to take us into places that are perhaps not for everyday experience. And today, I think we've had a wonderful session of poetry. So let us thank our two poets, David Salner and Thomas Zemsky.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thomas and Larry especially.
Well, it's been a joy to see everyone. I'm just going to say hi, Sarah. I think you may be the only person who hasn't spoken up. So it's just. But
I was going to ask a question, but
yeah,
yes,
go ahead. Yeah,
you.
You can go ahead. We got.
Oh, we have to.
I'll take your question. I'll take your question. We got about 5 minutes.
I mean, I was loving the institutional conversation, and the two of you, had me thinking about that word is really interesting, and what would you call the independent group of poets? I mean, there's a delta, right? And both of you, had a lot of references to Shakespeare and poets of the past, I guess, the giants. So I suppose my question is there, we are a group here meeting, certainly not, maybe we don't qualify as an institution, but there is kind of you have to know where to go. So is there something that we are? I mean, Larry's an independent press. Does independent capture that? And so I think you had me thinking about like, what is this gathering of independent poets, and how do you get into that world? Because institutions require sort of like a knocking at the giant steel door. How do you get into the independent world?
I know the advice given me, I want to make a big splash and become a famous poet in some way. And James Cummins and David Schloss, I can remember one Christmas, said, you're never going to be, you can't send a manuscript to Knopf or somebody, Harper's or something like that. You're nobody, you've never had a book out. They said, start local. Start local. That's how you begin. And I went to a poetry reading in Lexington, and Larry was there. And he was very alive. He was very alive, and he was very present. And I learned that he had a press. And so I approached him. I sent him a manuscript, and it worked. So I would never have gotten accepted, I'm sure, by any of the major publishers, because they don't take chances. They're a big deal. They're gonna be the same poets that are published in the New Yorker is the ones they're going to bring out their books. They're not going to take that much of a chance. But independent, small publishers can write on their own taste and write on their own courage, and that's your chance to get picked up and published, I think.
So we're a group.
I think there's a lot of there are poetry groups all over the country, and some are more interesting, and some are more interesting to certain individuals. But I think in general, they are more grounded. They're more, they're people with real life concerns, and so I think local poetry groups, writing groups, not just poetry groups, writing groups. Often there's a writing group that includes both poets and fiction writers, and I think they're often worthwhile. I encourage people to go to them and try them out, and those are a matter of the individuals that you run into. Sometimes you just can't relate to those individuals, but I think there are poetry groups where you'll find individuals you can relate to, and that it shows that there is a great interest in poetry today. I think it's really gratifying. So I think that's a good place. And working is not the reason to write to write good poetry. The reason to do that isn't to work. You work in order to make a living. And
Right.
I'm,
so you have to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to exercise my role now. It's time to take us out. So Sarah, I'm going to give you my answer to the question, and I think it's something that's represented by everybody that's in the room today. First, I think we can call ourselves a Zoom of poets, because that's kind of become our meeting place. But the word that I would counterpose to institution is community, and I think that what we have really seen over the last year and a half especially has been the creation of communities. And you and Indran are a wonderful case of that, you found your way to DC and you found your way to Indran, and the two of you are very much part of a community, and Broadstoners, we're a community. The nearly 100 or so people who have become part of my publishing family. So that's the way that I would answer your question, is that we are finding one another through the necessity of finding the people with whom we can communicate, with whom we can share experience, and from whom we can derive mutual support, particularly in these very difficult times. So I'm going to end it with that. Thank you for that
Thank you.
question. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. This has been
Thanks.
a special afternoon. Tune in October 23rd, Saturday will be our next Zoom event. We'll be announcing our lineup of readers soon, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Stephanie, you can take us out.
Thank you.
All right.